Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to 86th Societas Koreana lecture meeting. I'm Claire Kim, your MC for today's Zoom lecture meeting. Since COVID-19 pandemic started, the Societas Koreana has still tried to offer meaningful lectures to deepen the understanding of the Korean studies through specially made lecture videos and interviews, which are already uploaded in YouTube channel. If one of you haven't got a chance to watch them, please visit the Societas Koreana channel. Especially for this year's Societas Korean lecture meeting, we have prepared the Zoom lecture meeting, which enables us to invite the attendees through a web conference, as you can see. I'm really feel honored and pleased to invite and meet you all to the 86th Societas Koreana today. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Chung-kang, who is Associate Professor from the Department of Theater and Film, Hanyang University, who is going to give us an insightful lecture, Korean Cinema Now and Then. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor Kim. She achieved her doctoral degree at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2010 and joined Hanyang University in Seoul as developing research area of East Asian languages and culture. She's been studying in a very diverse and wide range of studies, such as new cultural history of modern Korea, Korean and East Asian cinema, gender and sexuality studies, democracy and human rights, etc. No further delay, I'd like to invite Professor Chung-kang Kim to the stage.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it is my great pleasure to be invited for this great occasion and talk about Korean films in this difficult pandemic situation through Zoom. So thank you very much for the Academy of Korean Studies for the invitation, and thank you very much for the audiences who are sitting over the Zoom screen. Today, I'm going to talk about Korean art film with the title Korean Cinema Now and Then, which sounds rather broad. But as a film historian, I cannot think about contemporary Korean films without old Korean films. So I'm going to talk about Korean films back and forth in between the contemporary Korean art films and that of the past. So let me begin with my first slide. Most of you must be familiar with the background of my first slide from the Cannes International Film Festival in 2019. South Korean director Bong Joon-ho and actor Song Kang-ho posed in front of the camera, and this was the monumental scene in South Korean film history as the first Palme d'Or given to South Korean film for Parasite. Following its success at this International Film Festival, the success of Parasite continued at the Academy Awards in 2020, where it won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Script, and the Best International Film Award. This was the first time in the history of Academy Award that the prize of Best Picture went to the non-English language international film. So the Korean press and media heralded this exciting news and shared this glorious moment celebratorily with the Korean people. It is not hard to imagine that most Koreans felt proud about the Korean film gaining such a recognition at the heart of global film world in Hollywood. On the other hand, from the perspective of a film historian, me, the success of Parasite and Bong Joon-ho is a remarkable event because this winning happened for the first time in the history of 100th year Korean cinema. Korean cinema has a long history of 100 years, but its history has never been central in the history of world cinema, and it remained peripheral for a long time. Given Korean film's recent success with global audiences, then it is questionable how it was possible or where such power could have been originated. Today, I'd like to link the recent success of Korean film with the longer history of Korean cinema, something which has been overlooked in the history of world cinema. So, regarding the success of recent Korean cinema in the global market or international film festival circuit, many of you perhaps understand it in the context of the success of global Korean culture, namely K-pop culture. K-pop culture, as we are all aware, is most prominent in the area of K-music and K-drama. And the success of BTS in the Billboard chart or Blackpink's astronomical number of views for their music video on YouTube and the global fandom of K-pop is indeed phenomenal. These days, in the Korean universities, we meet so many foreign students who came to Korea because they love K-pop, and my friends who teaches Korean studies in a foreign university, they also tell me their department is full of applications from the students who are interested in K-pop. In my own department at Hanyang University, we also receive more than 100 applications to study Korean film each semester. So in this regard, no one can easily deny that the success of Korean film is tightly related to that of contemporary global K-pop culture. Korean popular culture cannot be regarded as marginal anymore, and indeed it has become a dominant global genre. But today, I want to separate Korean film from this K-pop trend and shed a little more light on what lies behind this glorious moment in Korean cinema, because Korean films have much longer history of winning prizes in international film festivals, something that has long been forgotten. As a film historian, today's lecture will be mostly on the art house cinema of Korea from the past in the golden age and how such works have struggled to survive, and talk about how such works have struggled to survive in the national and transnational context. So let me begin with more recent stories of Korean art house cinema. If we trace the success of Korean film in international film festival in recent years, we can easily find out many Korean films have been nominated or won valuable prizes at major film festivals. Other than Bong Joon-ho, more recently, Hong Sang-soo won Silver Bear Prize for the best screenplay at Berlin International Film Festival with his film Introduction this year. This was his third Silver Bear Prize at Berlin. And if we go back to the early 20s, 2000, Park Chan-wook received the Grand Prix at Cannes with his famous film Old Boy. And Lee Chang-dong was also nominated for the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 2018 with his film Burning. Therefore, although Parasite is highlighted as the best example of Korean film success, in the past 20 years, the international film market had paid substantive attention to Korean art house cinema, and we have regularly witnessed Korean films winning at most prestigious international film festivals such as Cannes, Berlin, and Venice. So winning in an international film festival is often a way to elevate a film's reputation to status of high art. In other words, there is a discourse of art cinema indicating that those that win the prizes at the major and Western film festival are art. Although more international film festivals open their territories to relatively more popular films than they did in the past, there is a clear discourse to differentiate art house film from popular films. Just as the discourse of art for art's sake still exists in the field of art, in the film industry, there persists a similar notion that regards art house film as an ahistorical and universal art form. This idea of art cinema developed in Europe and is powerfully exemplified by European New Wave movement in cinema after World War II. So on the slide, you see the Jean-Luc Godard and the poster of Do the Right Thing. So he is a kind of the precursor of this movement. And so from this influence, cinema that had once been regarded as a mere entertainment rather than an art form began to be recognized as a distinctive art form through various movements and through the commissioning of international film festivals. And this discourse of art cinema, which had been strengthened through the prestigious international films, a film festival circuit in Europe, has lasted quite a long time within the wider history of world cinema. However, within contemporary scholarship on art house cinema, this type of judgment, valuing art cinema as something that contains a transcendent element of beauty that has lost its power, and a more contextual reading of art cinema has come to gain more academic acceptance. Many critics also pointed out that defining the stylistic and narrative features of art cinema is difficult, and it varies depending on the different institutions, locations, histories, and spectators relative to the context at hand. Moreover, cinema is a very impure and flexible art form from the beginning, particularly where the transversal complexities of a globalized society abound. So it might be correct to say that getting international recognition in a prestigious film festival is not merely due to the artistic quality of a film, but it is more to do with the politics of the time. Of course, I'm not denying the artistic quality of the films that won the prizes at the major film festivals, but I want to emphasize that this discourse is very much related to the contemporary politics. I also want to add one more point, that even though Korean film has gained some name recognition, its global cultural status is still very weak. So this is the webpage of Criterion Collection, and it has only 4 Korean films included in its World Classics section. And from the left side, The Housemaid by Kim Gi-young, and Secret Sunshine by Lee Chang-dong, and 2 of Bong Joon-ho films, Memories of Murder and Parasite. Only 4 films. So even if we now realize that some of the Korean directors are world-renowned, there is a long way for Koreans to go. And also, if you look at the title, The Housemaid, that was produced in 1960, you might wonder why this sudden jump or time gap exists from the films of the 1960s to the recent auteur films of today. This time gap is what I want to discuss mainly today. And if we go back to examine the history of Korean art cinema in the 1960s, the endeavors of Korean filmmakers made, then we will understand that the success of Korean cinema was not something that happened out of blue. So I also want to highlight how much referentiality exists within Korean cinema toward other Western or foreign national films, even though Korean films always categorized as K-brand. So let me go back to old days. So many of you might think that the 21st century represents the golden age for the South Korean cinema, since we have this feeling of emergent dominance of Korean film culture that even threatens the ubiquitous power of Hollywood. And while this is true, in fact, there was a previous golden age in South Korean cinema during the 1960s. So if you look at this chart, you see the sharp increase film production. So that is the number of the film production on the left side, and that is illustrated by year. And so there is a sharp increase of film production in 1960s. And if you look at this chart, it stops at 1970. And if you look at the other chart here, you see there is a sharp decrease of film production from 1970s to until like 2010. So we have a very long stagnation period. And now we are on different, like a new golden age. So there is a two golden age in Korean film history. So you might wonder what particular socio-political or context of Korean cinema industry in the 1960s influenced the formation of this original or old golden age South Korean cinema. And to talk about the beginning of this golden age, I'd like to explain a bit about the history of Korea during this time. After Korea experienced a devastating Korean War in the 1950s, the Reconstruction movement steadily gained impetus during the post-war period. In particular, in the early 1960s, when Park Chung-hee's new military junta came to occupy political power and initiated a new national developmental plan, the whole of the Korean society became influenced by this politics of national development. Since the government's power was essentially dictatorial, the heavy control of almost every sector of Korean life became commissioned by the state. So in the film industry, similar to other European nations that financially and institutionally supported their own national films, South Korean government also initiated a new motion picture law in 1962. And this law imposed 22 wide-ranging measures relating to censorship fees, screening permits, and producer registration and importing, exporting, and exhibiting films to protect and nurture South Korean film industry. The motion picture law also attempted to standardize production based on the Hollywood studio model, which required film companies to equip with larger studios and more cameras, staffs, and other facilities. And the photo you are seeing now is the Hanyang studio. That was one of the biggest film studio of the time in East Asia. So paradoxically then, the repressive political environment signaled the successful creation of state-sponsored golden age, leading to the diversification of film genres and the increase in audiences. This engagement, however, was not limited to the financial or industrial control of filmmaking, but the control of film content was also intensified. In 1966, the government clarified the standard for the high-quality film across three primary Korean genres: literary film, anti-communist film, and Enlightenment film. From this standard, we can see how arbitrarily the standard of art can be defined in a given political context. Among these categories, literary film was the most short-lived, specifically designating productions that drew directly upon celebratory literary works considered canonical within Korean culture. This can be regarded as an example of state-commissioned art film in the 1960s. And such films often engage in the emphasis of national stereotypes and therefore appeared as staged and contrived from the condescending Orientalistic perspective of many Western viewers. Films, as you see, The Seashore Village, that was produced in 1965, that was the Korean village, and these overtly aestheticized historical views of Korea were commissioned, and that was sent out for the international film festivals. The other strategy was to work in an ultra-modern manner and openly reject traditional film conventions of narrative and film narrative and style. These films attempt to set their stage within the new universal modern visual context of contemporary South Korean society, such as urban landscape of busy streets and high-rise buildings, and focus on different, fresh, and challenging lives of people, mirroring the way that European New Wave cinema innovatively portrayed the modern urban life. Occasionally, more extreme former and stylistic experiments were ventured. Here is the example of The Empty Dream, and this was regarded as very experimental and avant-garde cinematic endeavors. In short, although the government's implementation on award system of recognition of high-quality film was a repressive controlling measure within the South Korean Golden Age cinema, it nonetheless opens up a limited discursive space for filmmakers to experiment with new artistic trends and forms trends and forms. So in the next part, I'd like to introduce 3 different types of directors who are regarded as an artist cinema directors during this golden age. Although some of the literary films that were produced in the golden age were intended to exist within the category of art cinema, what is remembered and rediscovered as an art cinema in later period was overwhelmingly different from the genres that was regarded as art cinema in the past. For example, we saw in the Criterion Collection's choice of Kim Gi-young, The Housemaid, some films were rediscovered and re-evaluated as art films and new global classics. The Housemaid was one of the most popular films that was released in 1960 and offers a best singular example of the work of director Kim Gi-young. The photo is the director Kim Gi-young. And although he received an award for the best Korean film for this Housemaid, by the government, his film was never included in the category of art film by his contemporaneous film critics. Therefore, while it was a type of commissioned art film, it never achieved critical acclaim. But in a later period, in 1990s, he was covered as one of the best Korean directors, and a retrospective of his works was held at the second Busan International Film Festival in 1997. Since then, he has often been labeled as the Korean Hitchcock and has become a cult figure in Korean film history. Many contemporary Korean film directors, including Park Chan-wook and Bong Joon-ho, cite Kim Gi-young as the most influential Korean director relative to their work. Indeed, he is one of the most prominent film directors of South Korea, and over 30 years of his career, Kim Gi-young produced 33 films, which was, during their time, regarded as the most sensual, grotesque, and provocative films within Korea, and the themes and aesthetics of which far exceeded the social and cultural norms of the period. To better understand his world of cinema, I'd like to introduce some characters from within Kim Gi-young's films. So Kim Gi-young's most renowned film, The Housemaid, is a story of a South Korean middle-class family in need of housemates to perform normal house chores. However, different from the standard expectation of a family, sexually powerful housemaid used the opportunity to enter the household and seduce the husband. In the end, she finally destroyed the family by killing husband and even herself. Okay, so as you just saw, it is quite shocking and horrifying sequence, which I personally think more horrifying than Hitchcock, and became the signature scene of Kim Gi-young. And dragging the body of the housemaid down the stairs is a motif that appears repeatedly in his other films, such as Women of Fire, Hanyang, Insect Woman, Chung-kang, and other films continuously. Kim repeats similar themes and images of female and male iconography, creating a previously unseen vision of perverse sexuality within Korean films of the period. This series of works penetrates the socio-political condition of women in South Korean society and has come to assume a great and shifting significance for audience across different historical periods. And even in contemporary Korean film culture, Kim's influence still remains. For instance, Bong Joon-ho's Parasite. So you are seeing this scene still cut from the Parasite that shows the numerous stairways, and Bong Joon-ho said this was directly inspired by Kim Gi-young's housemaid. Bong even recommended that audiences watch his film together with Kim Gi-young's housemaid. As such, the film of Golden Age are not something that totally disappeared from the contemporary Korean film, but a foundation that has become a creative resource for Korean film directors today. Another original Golden Age art film director I'd like to introduce is Yoo Hyun-mok, who is perhaps the only film director who had been actively engaged in making art cinema from the beginning of his career to the end. Among his films, the most famous work would be The Aimless Blade, 오발탄, which is regarded as the founding canon of Korean realist film. Aimless Blade is based on a novel with the same title written by Lee Bum-sun, and it tells the story of a family whose members are all suffering from the scars of the Korean War. It offers critical views of poverty-stricken Korea and the agonizing suffering after the war. In the story, the family members aimlessly follow their own life path, and I would like to share one moment in the film when the younger brother in the family became a bank robber and is chased by the police after a failed attempt of a bank robbery. So as you just saw, this film shows the miserable situation of Koreans after the war, and I think this particular sequence showing a crying baby on the back of a dead mother who hanged herself incredibly captures the moment of tragedy. Indeed, it shows the most tragic moment of human life and represents more broadly the post-war despair of Koreans. In terms of film form, it follows the style of Italian neo-realism, and it is often compared to the Bicycle Thief. And the poster you see on the left-hand side, that is the Bicycle Thief, and on the right-hand side you see the scene of the Aimless Blade and this walking on the street with this miserable feeling. That is kind of the scene that is often compared. And this kind of critical expression within film was in fact possible because this film was produced in 1960 before Park Chung-hee's military government began and when a more democratic social atmosphere existed. But it was released in 1961 when Park Chung-hee had come to political power. So it confronted harsh censorship and was banned from screening because it showed the dark side of Korean society. But when this film was sent out to San Francisco International Film Festival, so you're seeing this, web page of San Francisco International Film Festival, and you see the Aimless Blade is listed there. This film was sent out this International Film Festival in 1963, and the government suddenly changed their attitude, and it was released again in that year in South Korea. Since then, Aimless Bullet has become a legendary film for surviving harsh government censorship, and later on it was shared by many within the anti-government movement group to boost the spirit of resistance in the 1980s. And today, it is still regarded as the most important realist film in Korea. So we can see how art film can be politically judged and accepted in one society relative to its own historicity. Under the situation of a military dictatorship, sometimes participating in an international film festival can offer a way to inspire or save the artistic spirit of a director. The final film I'd like to introduce is Mist, directed by Kim Soo-young. And Mist was based on the original novel, A Journey to Mujin, by Kim Seung-ok, a leader of revolutionary modern sensibility in literary circle in 1960s. Kim's novel inspired many of his young and educated contemporaries, including Hwang Hae-mi, the producer of Mist. She ambitiously proposed to make an art film based on Kim's novel. This, she hoped, would stand in direct contrast to other works of South Korean cinema, which she considers as merely commercial in nature. Working closely with the author and this ambitious producer, Kim Soo-young attempted to achieve this literary revolution of sensibilities on screen. He carefully edited the scenes to portray the consciousness of the protagonist using montage rather than linear and causative editing within the chronological order. Dialogue was kept deliberately sparse to let the image directly convey the story of the audience. Mist starts with the male protagonist Yoon Gi-jun revisiting Mujin, his hometown, after spending many years of his life successfully in Seoul. Yoon is a middle-aged man who married a rich widow and is expecting to inherit the company that his wife's family owns. But before he formally appointed as a chief manager, he visits Mujin and happens to meet a woman, Ha In-suk, a young music teacher who was just transferred to the town. Although the story of Mist seemed to focus on the short encounter between Yoon and Ha and their love affairs, the majority of film delineates the psychological state of Yoon and follows his recollection of younger days in Mujin. As you just saw, there is no spoken dialogue. As such, Mist demonstrates a most experimental mode of filmmaking. Many film critics praised Mist as a cinematic poem, successfully creating moods rather than following a simple story line and depicting humor interior emotion with European cinematic tone. This was also claimed by the international film festivals too. However, different from the contemporaneous people's enthusiastic acceptance of Mist as art film, this approach was not developed further as a particular auteur style by the director Kim Soo-young. For him, this was a one-time project to fulfill the state-commissioned art film production quota. So that would be probably why Kim Soo-young is rarely called an art film director in the history of Korean cinema. So what we can say about the concept of art cinema cannot simply be measured through a presumed transcendent artistic quality, but the value judgment applied relative to the socio-political and cultural situation of its production and reception. And seems like it's time to conclude. So, so far I talked about the various cases of art cinema within South Korea, which have negotiated national and transnational currents to create an idea of artistic quality and to survive the time. It is also interesting to see how art house cinema changed its boundaries depending on different institutions, locations, histories, and spectators involved. But before I conclude my talk, I'd like to mention one more significant issue in South Korean film history. That is the question of where are the female directors in the history of Korean cinema or the contemporary Korean filmmaking. What we have explored today as discussion are predominantly the male directors. Of course, there were female directors in South Korean film history, and from the 1950s to 1980s, there were only 4 female directors. And in the 1990s, more female directors became actively engaged in filmmaking industry, but it still remains hard to tell that is major film directors in Korea. So it has been over the last few years that we have seen the prominent rise of female directors in South Korea, and all the posters you see here is the films that was directed by female directors. Although they have not gained much critical attention as Bong Joon-ho or Park Chan-wook or other male directors, there are more and more female directors who are recognized in the independent film sector in particular. They have primarily created films that have had more moderate acceptance in genre, but enjoyed a much stronger success in the field of independent film. And now they have just begun to become involved in filmmaking with a bigger budget. So, to conclude, the recent global success of South Korean cinema did not happen overnight. There is a deeper heritage, and these endeavors still function as a powerful resource for contemporary filmmakers in Korea. And as exemplified by the winning of female director Julia DiCrino, Titan at Cannes this year, which was the second Palme d'Or given to a female director since Jane Campion's Piano in 1997. Perhaps the bringing of diversity to the story and forms of Korean film through female voices will be the hope for the future of art house cinema in Korea. Art house cinema, after all, always has been political. And if this political aspect of cinema provides us with some way to survive the current day and to overcome the limits of the past, I think we should always welcome its existence within the forum of international film festivals. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You're such an informative and insightful lecture. Okay. We already have one question from chatting box, so I'd like to read instead of all of us. What are the reasons for the Korean global culture impact being low, and how can they be served? That was from Mr. Solongo. Professor?
Well, yeah, I think that is a very difficult question, and even though I began with the connection with the K-pop culture, which is very, very dominant these days in popular culture in the global global scale, but Korean cinema is, as I said, is not that received that popularly, and that is very much to do with the this politics of international film or the definition of the art cinema that often defined by the West, not the East Asian people or the Korean people. So it is kind of sad for the Koreans to get the recognition in the world. They have to go out and get the recognition from the West first. So that would be primarily the reason, still many Korean filmmakers are struggling. But I think, since we are into the stage of very, very globalized world, and the things are changing these days. And as you see, many like Asian representation appears in the films, and Asian directors are recognized as the important directors in the world. So I think, there's no one way to solve the question, but I think in the future the situation will be different, and if the West does not consider Asia that significantly, it would be difficult for all the people to communicate in this globalized world. So I think the future is not so bad. So we are still working on many Korean filmmakers are working on it globally. So I think the future will be brighter. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Miss Anais, why is Korean art cinema that is successful abroad not so popular among the Korean public?
Art cinema is not popular for any audience. I think there are a very small number of people who enjoys art cinema, but as the teacher, as a person who teaches in the Department of Filmmaking, we trained students to be able to reach to artistic quality. So that means you have to gain some of the qualities before you have all the freedom to express yourself freely. So somehow art cinema is very detached from the popular audience. I think that is not just case of the Korea, but in the world is the same thing going on. So I think not particularly Korean cinema is uninteresting, but I want to add one more thing. For example, Bong Joon-ho's film is a genre film and never been considered as an art film before, but the concept of art cinema has been changing. So I guess it is more popular in Korea. If that is Bong Joon-ho's film is regarded as art film to other foreign audience, that is regarded as just national cinema and popularly consumed. So I think there is little difference in Korea. Korean people enjoys some of the popular type of art cinema. So yeah, that would be my answer. Yeah.
All right. Professor's answer reminds me of the saying people are saying director Bong, he became genre itself. Right. So it connects with the many ways, I think. So we have another questions from Pakistan Embassy. Mrs. Sarah, how do you think that the film Parasite impacted the global stage for Korean film industry?
Oh, I think the impact is huge. As he is just not awarded from the Cannes, but Academy Awards that is often given to American films, but this time it is given to non-English language Korean, non-English language film. So it was a kind of earth shaking things in Korea, and some of the Americans are criticizing that part, giving awards to the foreign films as the best award. So somehow through this event, many people actually, involved in the filmmaking, not just artistically, but they many of the Korean staffs who are working in the film industry, they began to be employed by the Hollywood in other nations. So I think the impact is not just the cultural impact, but there is a significant impact in the industry too. And also, as you saw, the winning of the Minari, that is American film, but that contains the experience of Koreans partially. The Korean experience. So I think this things are changing these days rapidly, and that might be related to this fast moving kind of exchanges between people in the globe. So I think the impact of a parasite is very important in terms of impacting the culture in other nations, but it also has great impact in the changing industries too. So.
Right. Okay. So one more questions. Munira Sharifi, hope I can be correct. Good afternoon. Do Korean cinematography collaborate with other film studios? How can this be done?
Oh, that actually began from the 1990s, surprisingly. So we have quite a history collaborating with other studios in other nations, and that began in 1990s when digital film introduced, and many people in Korea actually ventured to outside studios and have a heavy collaboration. And these days, I think more collaborations and many people, as I said, many foreign students are coming to Korea to learn about Korean making films in Korea. Now, it's Korean film is not something learning from the West in the stage of learning from the West, but in the stage of teaching. So collaboration, is going on both sides. So we go out and learn about new things, especially the technical things are learned from the West pretty much. But there are people who are coming to Korea and learn about making film in Korea. So I think that is the situation right now.
All right, Mr. Solongo also sent another message. What makes Korean films better than the other Asian countries, given the fact that Korean films have already received a few Academy Awards?
Oh, that is actually in Asia, there are so many great films, and there are also many great directors in Asia who were acclaimed by the West in the past. And Japanese film actually was huge from the 1950s and 1960s. So it is hard to say that Japanese film never been marginal, but other films, not Japanese films, other Asian films, they have been overlooked, of course, but. I think even though they did not get the attraction from the Academy Awards, but in many international film festivals, they becomes really successful. The Chinese film is huge right now, and also we see many the Southeast Asian films got awarded in many international film festivals. So in terms of the international recognition in the international film festival, I think Asian film was not that marginal, but in a way, the dominance was still was in the West for a long time, and it's changing. Yeah.
All right. We have many good and impressive questions from the attendees. I'm so impressed, and thank you for your participation and enthusiasm for today. Also, Mr. Wang Jongsun sent us, thank you for your lecture. What do you think about the relation between the K-pop and Korean cinema?
Well, that is an interesting question, and somehow more and more K-pop stars became an actors or actresses.
Right.
So I think they're empowering each other. So I think still K-pop is much more huge in terms of its industry dominance in the globe. But I think, by collaborating this, artist, like a popular artist in the K-pop, in the film or in the drama, that is another way to, make Korean film more popular for the global audience? So that is an interesting question. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Madame Tasigur also sent us, what is the attitude of Korean young generation to old classic films?
Well, that is a trouble I am having because I'm a film historian. So I'm teaching Korean history course, and I usually shows old Korean films to my students, and many of them are actually very much surprised by the quality of the film and the narratives and the stories are more than they expected. So they are so into the film. But on the other hand, the pace of the film is very slow. So there are ways to enjoy classic films, but if some students who are interested in watching old films, they are so in love with Korean classic films. But other students, like young generations, who are so into the fast movement of the films and the spectacles, they got bored. So that is a immediate response I can tell to this question.
Thank you for your attention and thank you for your interest, time. One more time. Yeah, thank you. So this is the end of the 86th Societas Koreana lecture Zoom meeting. And the next lecture will be resumed on August 20th, next Thursday. I really hope I can meet you all next week as well. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day. Thank you.